And I'm live with Julia Robertson. Thanks for joining me.
Sure. Hey, thanks for having me.
So, can you just start by telling people who don't know a little bit about your career and your writing, your journalism?
Yeah, sure. I write novels. I've got one of them published. The other one's kind of been kept off the shelf, which we'll get into later. And I also write articles across a variety of platforms and have had issues of censorship there.
Yep. So the censorship is something that I've been talking to a lot of people who've been censored and around this issue of gender. So tell us a little bit more about the backlash that you get that leads to the censorship. People who are listening to this probably know the gender wars. And when did you first hear the word TERF?
Um, I really don't remember when was the first time I heard it. I think probably the first and one of the few times it was used against me was with an article I did, I think in 2016 or 2017 for Huffington Post, which was promoted and then it was demoted. So
What was the article about?
it was about what was happening in the LGBTQXYZ community and how lesbians were being censored and kind of pressured into, um, you know, accepting males as partners, which is, a form of conversion therapy or like being asked to um, give up their, genital preference and unlearn their genital preferences. And this became like a pretty popular idea. And I was noticing a lot of publications started saying, putting out articles like that. And I was like, who's writing these articles? So I started really looking into who was working at different lesbian publications and started finding that the answer was not lesbians. So
Yep.
that's an issue, and it's something I very carefully brought up. I coded it heavily because I knew what was going on. I already knew that these topics were not to be discussed, and somebody still figured it out and went on the attack and was like, "You need to pull this down," yada yada yada, and it got demoted.
Hmm. What does that mean exactly that it got demoted?
Well, it was promoted. So like, it was made very easy to find on search engines, which happened with a lot of my work used to get promoted on Huffington
Mm-hmm.
as a contributor. And then when you demote it was not only made something that was harder to find, but you really can't find it. And it's pretty hard to find anymore. You have to specifically know like exactly where to go. So if
Mm-hmm.
someone were to search issues at, as they specifically pertain to lesbians or concern the lesbian community, they wouldn't be able to really, that wouldn't come up in a search
Mm-hmm.
anymore.
And did HuffPo ever tell you anything about that, or did they just do it?
No, I just did it.
Yeah. There's never really any communication. It seems there's hardly ever a chance where they go, what can you tell us about this? Let's have a conversation before they just start silencing.
Well, whoever first saw it, read it, understood it was an issue, and just made a decision to promote it. And then, you know, as it was kind of decoded, they suddenly realized this is an issue we can't really talk about. So even though it made sense enough to get promoted and it was like, this is an issue, it was called Co-opting the L, Homophobia and the Thought Police. It was later published to After Ellen, and I also published it on the velvetchronicle.com, which is a site that I started. Um, so yeah, they were just like, this is not something you're allowed to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Find it
And
interesting enough to promote it, but now it's being complained about by males, and it's got to come down.
mm-hmm. And how long have you had the Velvet Chronicle, your site?
Oh, that's a good question. I'd have to look to find out exactly when, but it was around the time or at the time where um, Kiara, a detrans lesbian youth, wanted to get her story out there, and I couldn't get anybody to publish it. including a lesbian site I was working with at the time. And that really bothered me because I was like, this young lesbian wants to tell her story and we got to get it out there. So I then started the Velvet Chronicle to give a platform to people who were not allowed to tell their stories because they were seen as, too controversial and,
So yeah, so the Kiara story was one of the first articles about that topic of detransition, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us more about Kiara?
It off. She's one of the first people who came forward and kind of really kicked things off. There were some people before, and they had done like YouTubes and stuff like that. I think this is probably when it really started becoming an acceptable topic to publish within. The left mainstream is the side that's like, no, we're not talking about this stuff. And then when the right mainstream does it, it's almost just discounted right off the bat. So in order to reach a mainstream left group of people, you have to not put it out through, on the right. And she was faced with feeling like, well, I can publish this on the right and be accused of being, a right-wing extremist or something like that, which is the go-to. When you can't publish on the left and you end up doing something on the right, the go-to is to say, you're an extremist.
Yeah, exactly. That's something that I've been just discovering since I got, canceled, and nobody on the left covered it. Well, in the US, hardly anyone covered it at all, but in the UK, it got some articles, and it was a lot of right-wing publications, and it was somewhat unexpected, especially like you said, then people would just dismiss it. Like people on Twitter, there was an article about my firing in the London Times by Douglas Murray. It wasn't an article about me, but they mentioned me. And someone just said, oh, well, if Douglas Murray is defending you, then you're really horrible. Like, it's just used to further dismiss.
Right, exactly. And as a lesbian, the work that lesbians do is unfortunately often seen as like less valuable or less important. So when something like what just happened with me, with my book happens, not a lot of people cover it. Nobody really covered it at all. It's kind of like this quiet thing that happened. And I think that's because the movement is made up of different types of people. At one point it wasn't. When it first started, it was made up of like people who were kind of in it for one reason. And as it's built, some other people have come into it, or quite a number of people have come into it. And a lot of people just really don't see lesbian work as being valuable or something to protect. And a lot of people in that movement, and this is a kind of point of with the lesbian community, they really have trouble with people like me who are married to, my wife is pretty darn non-conforming. She doesn't conform to the stereotypes. And there's almost a sense of like, well, this is your fault. So
in what way?
In the sense that lesbians have always kind of really pushed very hard against norms and stereotypes. So we're not gender critical per se, like in the sense that gender critical is used now, but we're some of the first pioneers in criticizing gender norms and stereotypes. So it's like in a different sense. So there's sort of a little bit of a divide between like lesbian feminists and then lesbian feminists who call themselves gender critical, and then gender critical, which sometimes more nowadays, not before, more nowadays will criticize or feel like an animosity towards lesbians who don't conform.
So they're kind of saying you brought it on by challenging the gender roles, and that somehow opened the door for, claiming to be the opposite sex. Or
I get the sense that a small portion there's a small portion of people that, or I don't know, even if it's a small portion, I don't know, I haven't done any studies of people that do have like an animosity. And I'm certainly not the first lesbian to point it out by any means. So it's just been something that's been noticed in the lesbian community, that there is a little bit less support when the work that we do gets us sort of booted and kicked off to the side. People don't really seem to care as much about it, which is reflective of what happens in mainstream media with publishing lesbian authors in general. It's really hard to get a book published with lesbian protagonists if there's a lesbian storyline, because it's not seen as valuable. It's not seen as something that's going to bring in the big bucks. It's not seen as something that's going to sell as well to mainstream writers. When my publicist first, gave my book out to readers, I said, don't even bother saying that it's lesbian, which was a big mistake on my part, because a lot of the criticism that came back was, this is a really good book, but we should have been warned about the sexual preferences in the book. And it's like, well, do straight books come with a warning? Because that'd be great.
Yeah.
Gay people, like, warning, sexual preferences of heterosexuality are in this book. Beware.
Yeah.
It's kind of a funny idea, like, that our books should come with a warning, but and then, I had like a reviewer on there that was like, we cannot review this book due to the content and nature of its content. It's like, so it is a reflection of mainstream kind of attitude towards lesbians, but also in particular lesbians who don't conform. And really, lesbians, by virtue of the fact that we're lesbians, are all non-conforming.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me, I spoke with a girl on my podcast who we kept her anonymous, but because she was only 15, and so we didn't, show her face, just her voice. And she is a lesbian and gender critical, and talked about how among her peers, it's basically just not cool to be a lesbian these days.
Absolutely. I hear that all the time. I have a lot of young lesbians who write to me, and I have a lot of young detrans, lesbian, and bisexual, youth who write to me, and they say the same thing, like that there's that issue.
Yeah.
School, or that there's I've been told that there's I'm going to do some air quotes, hierarchy, within what's now the LGBT community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then so now it's sort of, I guess, somewhat in some circles, it is cool to be trans. So you see all these young lesbians, or, it's hard to know if we can label them lesbians, but who are transitioning. And, I just finished reading Irreversible Damage by Abigail Shrier. And, and in the acknowledgements, your name was mentioned. So that was pretty cool. Yeah. So that whole issue now where young lesbians are being transitioned.
Right.
So yes. This is something that you cover a lot, and the Kirabel case just happened. So maybe we could, start there.
Yeah, well, I started, and this is part of what got me into a lot of hot water with my publisher from the very beginning, is that I, years ago, started really kicking and screaming about cognitive brain development, and saying, like, this is the sort of smoking gun with this, and just questioning, like, why is nobody talking about this? That kids who are being labeled as toddlers, who are being labeled as trans, kids who are being medicalized as early as 8, children who are being given double mastectomies in the US as early as 12 and 13 years old, haven't even come close to reaching full cognitive brain development. So the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that understands things like consequence, and the part of the brain that, is in charge of things like developing personality and, who you sort of become. But really the part of the brain that's like, oh, maybe don't get on the highway on the off-ramp, hasn't developed yet. So I started talking about that a lot, and was really making a big thing about it. And now, all these years later, when I questioned why I was being dropped by my publication, the response was, you have a transgender child? And that was asked sarcastically.
Wow.
Among other things. So there is this sense that I kind of was, the first to talk about this in the mainstream and bring it up as a mainstream writer, using my name, using my face, bringing it up constantly, and saying over and over again that it's unethical to medicalize and give surgeries to children way before they ever have a chance to reach full cognitive brain development. And I rarely changed my wording. I always kept it the same because I really wanted it to stick with people, to stick in their minds. Because I was originally in school to become a psychologist and ended up switching majors. And this to me was like, whoa, why is nobody talking about this? Anywhere. Why are we keeping this quiet? Why is nobody talking about 13-year-olds getting double mastectomies? Why aren't doctors talking about this? We don't let kids drive, rent a car in most cases till they're 25 and over, because we know, historically, or there's a big precedence for not allowing women under the age of 30 to get a hysterectomy, because there's this issue of brain development and being completely, you want to be completely aware when you make those decisions of what it can end up meaning at some point.
Yeah. I know I did some dumb shit at 24, so I'm just hoping that that's because of the can blame that on the brain development.
Me too. And the whole getting on the highway the wrong way, that's actually true story. That's what I actually did at one point. I was a teenager and I was just like, oh, this is no big deal. These are the things that you do when you're a kid, and there's a reason why you don't let kids do things like get tattoos. So we're not letting kids get tattoos, but we're letting them say, oh, I'm going to make this permanent medical decision that's going to affect my ability to have kids at some point. It's going to affect, it's going to take away sexual feeling, the ability to feel sexual feelings, a number of things. And this isn't even being explained to them. Not that they'd be able to understand it at such a young age, but it's not even being explained to them to the extent that they could say, oh, this isn't a good idea. But again, at that age, when you're 8 years old and someone's whether you're straight or you're gay, they're like, oh, boys, you're ew, and run away. Because that's just how kids are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And from a psychological perspective, I mean, what, for these young kids, what's the, I guess, level of suggestibility as you see it for wanting to transition?
Oh, it's very suggestible. I was telling, I did an interview a couple of weeks ago. We were saying there's this idea of taking these toddlers now and being like, this is my trans baby. And that to me is absolutely insane. My memories start at around the age of 6, meaning I really don't remember much from before then. So in the case of kids who don't conform to norms, which to an extent I certainly didn't, I was always getting about how I was not being properly female, and that's normal. Parents do that. That's just how things were done for a very long time. So there's a sense that here I could be at age 6 and not know how I ever got there, that at some point the adults in my life had decided, oh, you like all the wrong things and you don't like the right stuff. So you're a transgender child. You're a baby toddler. And that's really scary. It's really a scary notion, especially for lesbians, what's happening now, because you're seeing kids as young as 1.5, 2 years old being labeled as transgender, and nobody seems to think that that's strange. Imagine if my parents had walked around being like, this is my lesbian toddler. People would think it was absolutely nuts. They would be like, what? How are you labeling your kid? You let them, they're a toddler. But there is this sense of oh, don't ask, because then they're going to label you transphobic. And like you said, a turf, and all bets are off.
Yeah. And then when you bring the medical industry into the mix, where now it's, if the parents are prone to that kind of thinking, where they think their non-conforming kid has some kind of an issue, they can bring them to the doctor, and then they will potentially be put on this track, be prescribed puberty blockers. And
progressive gay conversion therapy.
Yeah.
It's a way, like the United States, for example, it's a melting pot. So it's not like people could say, oh, that would never happen in the US. We have everybody in the US. We have every culture, religion, belief system. We're all here. In Iran, it is punishable by death to be homosexuality, and it's perfectly fine to be transgender. So you've got death penalty, change your sex. And in other cultures, with a lot of the stories that come out through HRC, if you really look into these parents and you look back, and they come from a strong religious background, like, not to point fingers, but maybe like Christian or something. And you've got a parent who's like, oh my God, I thought my kid was gay. I was absolutely terrified. Oh, thank God, a doctor explained to me that they're actually transgender. So you've got a lot of homophobia, and people don't really think about that in the United States, there are a million different types of backgrounds and cultures where, yes, it is preferable to have a gay kid. And I mean, to have a kid change, go through a sex change. And it's absolutely the worst possible scenario for these parents to have a gay kid. So there leaves a huge door open for parents who don't want gay kids. And that's something where if you bring that up, even as a lesbian, people are like, you're bringing that up, you're crazy. And we're just like, no, this is a real thing. We need to talk about this, because not only is this child at a point where they're very far from having reached full cognitive brain development, I mean, really far, but we're also talking about a situation of gay conversion therapy that's being labeled progressive and celebrated by organizations that used to protect gay and lesbian children, but they absolutely do not anymore. They're protecting their assets, they're protecting money, they're taking money from big pharma, but they're not protecting gay and lesbian kids. On the contrary, they're actually promoting these kinds of parents who are transitioning their kids, really young, and just popping a label on their kid and then, putting them on that path.
Yeah.
Statistically speaking, 75% of these kids would grow up to be LGB if they're allowed to grow up, and 85% of them would grow up to be LGBS, meaning S meaning straight.
Oh, okay.
So the majority of these kids would grow up to be gay and lesbian, which does make this a massive human rights violation of gay and lesbian youth. Again, something we're not supposed to talk about.
Yeah. Where do you see that shift happening, where it became the progressive opinion to not even question this stuff?
I think people are afraid of having happen to them what happened to you and what happened to me, which is that you say something about it and your life's work goes up in flames. And in some cases, with lesbians in particular, your life's work is going to go up in flames and people aren't going to care. And in your case, to an extent, your work, you've been penalized, and what's come of it? And that's what people think, is what's going to become of the work I do. And that is a realistic concern. That's why if you look at the landscape of what's kind of been coined like the gender critical movement, but really it's made up of lots of different types of people. Straight people, it's made up of, worst case scenario now at this point, it is made up of people who don't like gay people. It's made up of really well-meaning feminists. It's made up of lesbian feminists. But if you look at the movement, the landscape has changed immensely, whereas a few years ago, there was to maybe two handfuls of women who were showing their names and face. Um, and I was in that camp of people who were like, here I am. And then there was people who came along now, and if it's changed immensely, where so many more people are showing their names and their faces. But that takes a very big level of being able to put yourself on the back burner, being willing to leap out into the void and hope for the best and know that it's not going to go well.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, even when you spoke up, I'm sure to an extent you knew, you know, there is a very good chance that there will be repercussions for this. And anytime you have a situation where women are feeling there could be repercussions, you gotta really look at why.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Why are they scared to speak? And is it okay that they're afraid?
Right. Yeah, that fear is so strong and so palpable. You know, I talk to people who even are some of the most outspoken people on this topic, and then they still will say, well, I would be afraid to say, you know, trans women are men or something like that. It is scary. The bullying, the level of bullying that comes back at us.
Absolutely. And I'm really proud of you and some of the other young feminists who've come out and spoken up and dealt with the consequences of speaking up. At the same time, I feel terrible about what's happened. And that's part of the reason why I never really pushed and said, hey, more of you need to show your face.
Mm-hmm.
I know that it's a big ask. But at the same time, it's like if we don't do it, then we just watch the rights change. You know, like they're trying to erase sex as a protected class in law. A lot of people don't understand that. So, like you said, with the trans women are women quote, which has been very popularized and very widely spoken and repeated, while I understand the compassion behind that people feel, at the same time, people aren't really thinking logically about what it means to say trans women are women. They are just only thinking of that this is a nice thing to do, or it makes them feel empathetic, or it makes them feel like they're a good person or something like that. But what they're not thinking about is how it's going to impact statistics. So now you're seeing more and more and more and more that women have committed these crazy crimes in the news, and this is how it's being reported,
Mm-hmm.
that are a reflection of male violence. There's no studies to prove that male violence just magically poof disappears when you decide to identify out of being a man. So you see statistics majorly shifting there. You also see issues where it's been taken to the extent that males are being put into things like female rape shelters and prisons. And, you know, when I say this, a lot of people are also going to not think to themselves that the majority of these males who do identify as transgender women will have kept their male genitalia. I don't completely quote me on this. I believe the statistic is 80% of them will have kept their male genitalia. So people are really, their brains are already being rerouted with this trans women are women, because they're being rerouted to think of this in a very literal sense. And this is what words do. This is why words matter. And here I go with my brain nerd stuff again, because I'm very nerdy when it comes to brain stuff, which is to say that the way that you use words does reroute your brain.
Mm-hmm.
So when you keep saying trans women are women, it reroutes something in the brain to where you really begin to view this in a way that is concrete, to say they are actually women. And again, I understand the niceness behind this, but I also understand the danger in denying reality. I understand the danger in forcing people to lie, legally enforcing them to lie. In Canada with the Jonathan case, and at the time when I reported it, I did call him Jonathan and him because that's how he referred to himself. Because they weren't allowed to use words in Canada anymore, nobody was allowed to really accurately describe what had happened.
Yeah.
I was able to do it as being in the US and having freedom of speech and not being in Canada. I was able to say, here, this is what's happening. This is what Jonathan looks like. This is Jonathan's name that Jonathan goes by. This is Jonathan's pronoun that he uses. This is Jonathan's picture. Jonathan looks like most of your brothers and fathers might look. This is who is suing over a dozen immigrant minorities because he wants them to wax his genitalia. They weren't allowed to say that in Canada. They were only allowed to say a trans woman is suing for the right to be treated equally and have services done, beautician services done. So it does this thing where if you're in Canada and you can't really, you're no longer allowed legally to get all the full facts, it creates a very dangerous for women to not be allowed to do that. And I think I'm, even in the States, I might have been the only person to report it with a photo, with a name, with the correct pronoun being used at the time. And other people were still doing the whole dance. And that dance is a dangerous dance. It endangers women's ability to understand how their rights are being stripped away. It strips away their right to understand how protecting sex as a protected class in law is important, especially given that women are historically one of the most subjugated classes, often horrifically, globally, and why we might need to keep those protections. So, playing around with words and, calling out that play on words, it becomes a challenging situation where you want to be respectful and you want to be polite and understanding, but at the same time, in order to point to all the things that are happening legally and how this is dangerous, you have to be able to talk about things in realistic words that people understand in a universal language, which leads to why lesbians were being accused of bigotry.
Yeah, it makes me think of two things with the language. One is that, as you said, they're using the language of segregation. So, about Jonathan Yaniv, it's like he wanted, or if how they would report it is like a trans woman wanted equal access to services that women get. That's obfuscating what really happened, which is that someone with a male body, no matter how this person identified or thought of himself, went into, for one of the incidences, went to a salon and wanted the waxing that women get, like a bikini wax. And then they're like, that's a whole different thing. We don't do that. We don't do male genitalia. So and then they're couching it in this language of segregation, like the mean women are trying to have this exclusive space and keep out other women. And then the other thing that it makes me think of is this cognitive dissonance that you get when you have to repeat a statement like trans women are women. And like you said, I want to have that respect for their identity and for just their personhood. But when you have, and when you have that expression, trans women are women, it's like something doesn't fit because you see a male, but you're saying that so, and then psychologically, what do you think of this? Because it's like something has to adjust. And since the thing you're seeing can't adjust, you have to almost change the way you think and perceive.
Absolutely. And they're raising kids now with this gender ideology. And gender ideology, for that reason, it's damaging to people's ability, not only their right to believe and speak about reality, but also to the next generation's right to be able to perceive that reality and have a vocabulary that describes that reality in a way that they can do things like protect their rights. Because if you can't have the language to protect your rights, you can't protect your rights. If I have to dance around and dance and dance and dance to explain why I should have rights as a subjugated class, then I'm spending a lot of time dancing, and people are going to be processing the words that I'm saying. in a very different way than they should be able to process them. Like, boom, I understand what you're saying. Done. I shouldn't have to use 20 words to say I'm a lesbian.
Yeah.
I should just be able to say I'm a lesbian, and people should understand that that means that I'm a female and I'm exclusively same-sex attracted. And that's part of where we're seeing definitions being pulled out of the dictionary and rewritten. You know, major gay and lesbian organizations that previously were set up to protect gay and lesbian rights are now doing the same thing. They're yanking those definitions and redefining them in a way that does leave it open for people to say your sexual preferences, you need to unlearn them. That's a real thing that's said, and that they're bigoted, and that, you know, genital preferences are wicked, horrible things. Like, you know, so now you need 20 words to describe one thing. So the ability to speak and communicate is being impacted. So if it was a case as it was previously, because it was for a while there, where it's a matter of, you know, oh, my trans guy friend now identifies this way, so I'm going to call him by this, and that pronoun. I get it, yada, yada. It's now become an issue of, if I give into this language, it has a huge ripple effect on women's rights globally, our ability to protect ourselves, our ability to speak in ways that can describe our experience as a unique experience. It then becomes an experience that anyone can identify into, that's not unique. There's no qualifications for it. You know, as I said, somebody who looks like your brother or your father, and really makes, not that this makes a huge difference, especially not in my world, doesn't make an effort to change their appearance, which has always been, you know, not, I don't really think that women should have to look a certain way, obviously, or men, but it's opened the door up to a lot of people to identify into something and just say, deal with it. Like Alex Drummond. If anyone wants to Google that, Alex Drummond, who's with Stonewall, one of the big LGBT organizations in England, full beard, lesbian. And then if you don't accept the idea of being with that person as an actual lesbian, you become the bigot. You need to unlearn your preferences. And that's gay conversion therapy.
Yeah, that's a point I've been thinking. I've been thinking a lot lately about just exactly what you said about how people don't necessarily know that the trans umbrella now includes people who just don't actually make physical changes. So like you said, it's not that I'm saying, oh, you should go get these surgeries or you should do that if you want to be seen as a woman. It's just that people don't know that when we're talking about this, we're talking about people who really aren't doing much at all. I mean, like you said, if you look up Jonathan or Alex Drummond, you'll see someone who clearly hasn't undertaken a life of trying to pass as a woman. It's quite different.
And they're like, oh, I want to expand the bandwidth of what it means to be a lesbian. The bandwidth of lesbian doesn't really need to be expanded, buddy. We're good. It's the word, it has a meaning, and you're violating basically the boundaries of innate sexuality. And it's innate to the extent that it can't be unlearned. You know, like, I think lesbians are a little bit tired of being told, well, maybe if in the right scenario you find a male attractive. Well, maybe if we present the male in this way, it'll be attractive. Well, maybe, did you try? Did you give it a go? You know, or did you pray? Work on that. Did you pray to get your way? And now we've got a situation of, did you think your way out of it? Because this is what we were often told now, is that we can think our way out of sex attraction if we can just adjust the way that we think. It's a very, it's all connected, and it's a very nasty cycle that is a snowball effect. So it seems like this super basic thing, and at some point it was pretty basic, until people really took it very literally and started doing things like stripping women of having the right to say that they're same-sex attracted, for example, or we have the Equality Act in the US right now where, you know, they're trying to erase sex as a protected class in law. And all they need to do to fix that, and I worked on a letter for this to send to Congress with an organization that I'm with, is to remove the words gender identity and replace them throughout with the words sexual orientation and sex stereotyping. It's a simple fix. And we have in the United States proposed that to Congress through a letter, and explained how and why it erases sex as a protected class in law. Whether or not they're going to do anything about it remains to be seen, but it's not looking too good when you have Nancy Pelosi, for example, putting out rules to get rid of gendered language like mother and father within the House rules. And, you know, her and a number of Democrats proposed this. Or when you have people like Dakota saying, let's just get rid of rules that were set in place 100 years ago by feminists to give an equal seat to males and females at the table. So you've got, you know, sex parity rules where you have to have one male and one female, called the one male, one female rule. That's being dismantled and was at one level dismantled, and now they're going for the next and the next and the next and the next level to dismantle this rule, you know, which anybody can Google or look up the story that we did on that, and it's being kept quiet. So we were the first to break that story, and it's clear that they don't want people to know what's going on. And this is happening, by the way, with Democrats.
Yeah.
And if I point it out, by the way, I should say that I will be quickly accused of being a fan of Trump.
Yeah.
So disclosure, I'm not a fan of Trump.
Yeah.
I am a fan of truth and transparency and telling people the truth about what's going on.
Yeah,
it's a big problem with that.
Right. It's like, I'm pretty sure that Trump doesn't, you know, isn't in the same camp as like radical lesbians and feminists. No. And yet, so what was the name of that person that you just mentioned that you reported on?
Oh, Dakota? Dakota.
Okay, just so we got that on there so people can go look it up. So now, what was the J.K. Rowling thing with your book? What happened there?
Well, the month after J.K. Rowling posted my work to her page, my publisher informed me that they were dropping me, and that they were pulling my book off the shelf on January 1st.
Of this year?
Right, and that's when the company would be switching hands. So the ex-CEO was handing the company over to her left-hand person. And when I questioned the decision, the CEO wrote back, among other revealing to me that she had a transgender child, which clued me into something I was already aware of, which is that my political stance had been problematic. And I had since I had signed, just after I signed, they discovered my political stance. And it had from then on been sidelined and treated like kind of the wicked stepchild. I was treated differently from their other authors. So for example, other authors had like an author's page on their site. Mine was left blank the whole time. I had to agree to a stipulation saying that I would personally promote to LGBTQ people rather than just promote the book as a lesbian book. So for example, every time the publication promoted my novel on social media, it was hashtagged with LGBTQ books, quote unquote, and LGBTQ fic, whereas all the other authors' books were simply hashtagged with things like lesfic, lesbian fiction, lesbian romance. So it was clear for a while that they were really like, I'm not touching you.
Yeah.
Like they were aware of the stance, and they had, formally asked me to make changes that they didn't ask their other authors to do, and were implementing those changes fully on my book. My readers were also charged more for my book than
Oh.
authors. And I never received a single penny in royalties.
Mm.
And after I was dropped, while I never threatened to take legal action, the CEO in this letter, telling me that she had a transgender child,
Mm.
um, said that if I took legal action, which again I never said I would, that she'd sue me for not disclosing health issues before I signed with them, uh, and that she would argue that she'd been duped by a failure to divulge pertinent information about my health,
Mm.
and that she would make the case that I owe the publication money
Mm.
because of that.
Wow.
Which, by the way, to treat anyone different due to a medical condition, not it's not kosher.
Yeah.
So any court would be like, what?
Right. Right.
That proves that there's yet another thing that you're going against kind of legally in law, like to not treat people differently based on a medical condition or, stuff like that. And it was ended with, that's your choice to make.
Wow.
Try to get these royalties or any royalties, I will sue you. And you'll pay me.
So they said if you try to get any royalties, they will take action?
That if I were to sue them, which I didn't say, I never said I would,
Mm-hmm.
they would argue that, and they'd sue me for.
Mm-hmm.
And the book itself also happens to be an award-winning novel with a sequel. That's another thing. I was not allowed to give them the sequel. I wasn't allowed to give them anything else I wrote, whereas their other authors are allowed and actually encouraged to do so. It's not so. In other words, it's not like this was like a bad book or anything like that. My publicist had it on the LGBTQ bestseller list in the first week out, and this is 4 years ago. She ended up quitting because she was like, I've never been treated like this.
Wow.
So they were really like pushing her buttons as well. So they kind of discovered this stance that I had, and as soon as they discovered that stance after they signed me, everything just completely changed. And the whole thing with J.K. Rowling, I think that just pushed them over the edge. That someone with such a big platform elevating my voice and kind of routing people to my site, that it just was like the final straw where they were like, we're pulling the book.
In another world, it would have been, oh my gosh, Julia, J.K. Rowling just mentioned you. You just boosted sales and you're now our star of the publishing house.
Right. It'd be used to the advantage, and it would be used to maybe sell books in a different world. And also none of it made any sense. Their own senior editor had said, this is the best book they've given me to edit in a long time. So that's a quote. HarperCollins actually gave me permission to share what they had said about my book in writing, which was that it was exquisite and that it was a page turner with characters that kept them turning the pages. So they weren't, I did work with them. They were originally considering the book for publication. They even had me work with an editor that they set me up with, who was amazing. I revised the book with her, but ultimately they decided they couldn't publish the book. This has a lot to do with what I was saying before about mainstream acceptance of lesbians still being a lot further back than people think it is. They perceive it to be one thing. It's really something completely different. It probably to them could have been an issue of they were worried it wouldn't sell well. I'm not really sure. I just know I'm very grateful that they let me use that quote from HarperCollins saying it was with it, and they obviously were wishing me well. So this publication doesn't have a whole ton of award-winning writers with them. They also are saying that they really want women of color writers. I was one of maybe 3 that they had, or maybe 4, I don't know, that I've looked into. And I was the only Arab American writer that they had. So a lot of what they're saying doesn't make sense to pull the book off the shelf. They should have been happy to keep a book like this on the shelf and work with me. And like you said, you everything to promote it more, but this was personal.
Yeah. You can like not answer this if you don't want to reveal this, but do you have a literary agent?
I'm actually talking to somebody who Kathleen Stock referred me to. And I'm sure, it may or may not be her cup of tea, and that's something that's important to literary agents. I don't have one at the moment. I'm open if anyone's interested. It is going to be hard to get someone to be interested because I am now officially the canceled woman.
Yeah.
And I'm a canceled lesbian.
Yeah.
Because that's, it is a little bit different. And I would like to acknowledge, especially on behalf of the lesbian community, that there is a difference, because I think that to not acknowledge that isn't really fair to the lesbian community, to just say that there is a difference between getting a lesbian book published and getting a book that's considered more mainstream that will sell more published, that there is a sense that we need to come with a warning label, and that there is less concern when lesbian works get pulled or demoted. Sometimes it'll be, used to make a bigger point, but then the actual concern isn't always completely there. But then there's amazing people like yourself, and some other straight authors who've been incredibly supportive, where I'm just like, you give me so much hope that the world is actually changing, and that people do actually care about lesbian work being demoted and erasure, because they erased it. They pulled it off Barnes and Noble, which means they pulled it off Kobo. And they didn't just pull it off in the way that you would normally pull off a book, because usually those remnants would remain. They erased it. It never existed. Even professional reviews, gone. Stuff I've written for some lesbian magazines that are no longer considered themselves lesbians, that now consider themselves LGBTQI publications. Work of mine dating back to 2006 no longer appears.
Wow.
In a lot of cases. I'm a bad person.
Yeah, you're like the picture in the photos with Stalin where he just erases them out.
Right. Just, she never was there. And I did a lot of work dating back to 2006 to increase things like visibility for nonconformity and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. There's really, it's been horrendous.
Yeah. So you mentioned some other authors have been great and supportive. So I was wondering if anyone in the publishing industry kind of has reached out or anything. I can say for myself, when I was fired, I was new to the industry, so I wasn't like a known entity in any way, or I didn't know that many people in the industry, but I think a lot of people heard about it. It kind of blew up those couple days that it happened. And, not a single US publishing person reached out to me. Some from the UK, but
nobody has. But Miss Phillips and Miss Bindell, who are both really incredible and have been amazing. I don't know. I'm sure you've read Julie Bindell. Mm-hmm. Have been incredibly supportive. Kathleen Stock has been very supportive. So there have been a few women who've reached out and really been exceptional and been like my rocks as I'm going through this, and have really been like, what can I do to help? Like, here, let me send you to this person I work with, or hey, let's talk about doing this, or let's set up a Zoom meeting and discuss this. Mm-hmm. So that's been really something that's given me a lot of hope. People like you, particularly when straight people reach out, I'm really like, okay, like there are people who get that this is something that is not only difficult, but all the more difficult as a lesbian who had a hard time getting published in the first place.
Right.
I know it's hard to get published to begin with, but you throw a lesbian character in there, it's something to consider. How do I write this character? How can I weave this in? Do I make the sexuality secondary? Well, maybe if I kind of downplay it and make it about something, it's like a lot of mind games that take place that you have to like make decisions about in order to make the book marketable or to give it a chance. Like my book isn't like the kind of like more cliche, like my lover Cindy arrived, her pink bra strap fell off her shoulder. It was written in a way that avoided every single cliche, that avoided coming across as like, oh, so sexy. It was like it was done in a way to very casually and organically introduce this relationship between the protagonists and to create a world around it and a whole environment and town and vibe to that town around it, to make it interesting to straight people to read as well as gays.
Mm-hmm. Is there anywhere that people can get their hands on your book right now?
No. It has been yanked. It is gone. And as far as I've had a lot of people say, oh, why don't you self-publish? And this is probably hard to explain to anyone who hasn't been in the publishing or hasn't really tried to get something published, which is that I waited over a decade to get the book published in the way that I felt was the best way, or that would help me to be the most successful. And there is a sense of I waited that long to do it. To self-publish at this point feels to me like a bad, almost like not a step that I feel comfortable doing. And at the same time, a lot of publishers won't touch books that have been published already. So they kind of, when they did this, put me in a very difficult position. So it's not just we're pulling the book off the shelf or erasing you never even existed. Well, good luck.
Yeah.
You did the wrong thing.
Gotcha.
We're spotlighting you, and we are going to make sure we do everything we can to watch your chances go up in flames, your life's work.
Yeah.
I wrote that book out of college. I waited a long time to get it published. I shouldn't have had to wait quite that long to get anyone to publish the book. And this publication also now, as of the last year, is now LGBTQI publisher.
Yeah. And for them to, the publisher is supposed to be your biggest cheerleader and your biggest promoter, and they're not supposed to screw up your chances to make money off of your book.
Right.
So going back to the statement from your boss, or not your boss, sorry, for someone from the publishing house who said, my kid is trans, right? So I don't know if it was in Schreier's book or someone else I just heard recently saying that it might be the people who can never come around to this or who can never sort of change their minds are the parents who have trans their kids, because they've just taken a step that if they actually decided it was wrong would be like too horrible. Like they would have had to admit they've done something horrible to their kid, which no parent can, easily admit. So I don't know. I think that it gives a bit of context, because that's such a horrible thing to say. It's bizarre and it's awful for her to say that to you. And the implication that somehow, go ahead.
Well, and to clarify, I don't know if she meant transgender child in the sense that my parents still call me their child. but I'm an adult.
Right. Okay.
But they'll always
Okay.
be as a child.
Yeah.
Like that's their child.
Mhm.
I don't know in what sense it was said or revealed to me that, like, are we talking about literal child? I doubt it.
Okay.
It's more likely, but I don't want to guess on that.
Right.
So, but yeah, there is a sense of sort of either defending a child's, or what would be seen as a child, their decision, or defending a decision to go along with it, or defending creating an environment in which that child maybe came to view themselves in this way. Because a lot of the time, when a child does view themselves in this way, it's because of the environment. Kids don't just come up with this stuff on their own. A toddler just doesn't come up with this sort of thing on their own. They are routinely, told. And in a lot of cases, people, I should say most cases, I've discovered HRC promoting parents, you'll go back and discover an environment where the child was physically abused for liking the wrong stuff and toys, where schools were told to take those toys out of the rotation so that their child wouldn't play with them. So you see a very strong emotional and physical abuse that creates an environment where the child develops that sort of, they don't even develop the identity in a lot of cases. The tag is placed on them, the label's placed on them, and then I'm sure by the time they're 6, 7, 8 years old, they don't even know how they ever got there. They only know a world where they're the opposite sex, and they've got to do all this stuff, and this is something that's been decided by doctors and their parents and professionals and promoted by the HRC, and now they're on a platform and they're 10 and they're wearing a suit and they're snazzy and everybody's cheering for them. They don't know how they got there.
Yeah.
We know. The lesbians know.
Mm-hmm.
We have insight. Nobody wants to hear it, but that's why we were among the first to be like, yo, because we all could see ourselves in those shoes. The person that we're dating and the person that we're with. There was a time, when I first came out, having long hair was like really unusual. Or, being like, I'm going to do air quotes again, being feminine was unusual. And I'm saying that because I don't think there's anything less feminine about having short hair and rocking a buzz cut and wearing a suit. Yeah. Personally, as a lesbian. That's my culture. Mm-hmm. But yeah, being feminine was kind of more unusual at one point. So we're talking about a significant part of the lesbian population that would be affected.
Yeah.
Had they grown up in a different time.
Right. Do you think that, as a kid, do you think you would have ever, had you grown up now, would it have ever been something that floated across your mind?
My parents are too grounded, and absolutely no with me. Had I moments, yes, where I thought I was supposed to be a boy? Yeah. I have memories going back to when I'm pretty little, playing on the lawn and thinking, oh, was I supposed to be a boy? But this has a lot to do with things like coming to grips with sexuality. It has a lot to do with coming to understand a world where you don't fit the stereotypes and people keep telling you you're supposed to fit the stereotypes, and that can be very confusing to a young child's mind. We only know what's around us. We only know the environment around us. So if the environment around us is constantly saying, you shouldn't sit like this because it's masculine, or you should want to carry a purse and you've never carried a purse. I won't carry a purse. I think I did it like once or twice in my life. Or you should want to wear heels. I had an extreme aversion to wearing heels for a very long time. It was a battle constantly. I just wanted to wear tank tops and jeans that were 10 sizes too big for me. And, hair was always pulled back in a ponytail. And you're constantly being told by the world around you that this isn't the way that, females are supposed to behave. You just start to think that, oh, maybe something went wrong. And I think the last time I recall thinking this, I was maybe like 20, 21. And I was with somebody I was dating, and, there is the sense of, oh, if I was a guy, this would be a lot easier. Because you're really trying to understand how you're going to exist in a world where, being who you are is so unacceptable. And if there is this idea that it is really acceptable now and that we don't face discrimination. And I understand that this is probably the perception, and I understand why it's the perception. There is discrimination every time my wife and I leave the house. We have to wonder if we're going to have a bad day, how people interact with us. It is very much alive and well. It is very much a thing where people will still intentionally say, you know, excuse me, sir, or, you know, avoid pronouns altogether. And it's not, oh, this rare thing that hardly ever happens. And it's also not something where a lot of people say, oh, it's probably an honest mistake. It's not an honest mistake. We've tested that theory on multiple occasions. Probably like, and my wife will have da 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 da, and they'll be like, so what's he gonna have? So it's not a situation where it's an honest mistake. It is being done on purpose, and it's gotten, I can't even tell you how much worse since the whole ask my pronouns thing.
Yeah, because I think it's like now we're trained to have to use he pronouns if a woman looks slightly masculine and vice versa.
Right.
Yeah.
People up. So people, when people do it, it's for a few different reasons. And again, this is the amount of times it happens is a fairly new phenomenon. With maybe the last 5 to 10 years, it's gotten worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. It's either people who are really angry about being pushed, or it's people who maybe want the extreme lefty type who really want us to view ourselves in a different way because it makes their kind of ideology make more sense. The number of reasons why people do it, but it's happening a lot more now that there's this enforcement and this attempt at legally enforcing people to use words and how they use words.
Yeah. To kind of end with, so I just started a new project in joint with MK Fain, who runs 4W, the website, and we're going to be doing advice for other young women who are gender critical or whatever it is. They have questions about all this stuff. Do you have any advice for young women, maybe teens, young lesbians who are trying to navigate all this craziness?
I'll usually tell or kind of keep an open door policy with my inbox for both parents and kids. And if they're kids, they, you know, with of course their parents' knowledge and stuff, to go ahead and call me if they have questions about being a lesbian, or, you know, if there's something, if they felt pressured maybe and they need a little mentorship, or parents are confused about, you know, there was a parent recently, not too long ago, I'd say maybe a few months ago, I have no concept of time anymore, who was, you know, their daughter came out as a lesbian, and their first question to them was, well, what's your gender identity? Because this is what they're teaching parents, and it's dangerous to lesbians, because now you've gone and put an idea into your child's head because they don't conform to norms, and your child's just told you they're a lesbian, and what have you done? You've said, well, are you sure you're not a guy? Because that's what it is. That's what it boils down to. I'm a lesbian. Are you sure you're not a guy? And that's not something new. That's something lesbians have been hearing for a really long time. I did an article called 100 Girl Meets Girl on the mainstream TV and Not a Butch in Sight. They've very intentionally pushed this idea that lesbians are men for a long time. So I would say, you know, inbox me, or if you have questions. General advice, I don't even know anymore, because I see what happens to people like you, and I don't want to be responsible for lives going up in flames. And it is at a point where I'm sure lesbians are feeling like if I tell the truth, my life will go up in flames. And they're not wrong to think that. I'm very ill. I'm an
Yeah.
example happening. I would just say don't believe that your innate sexual orientation is any kind of a preference, or that it's in any way biased, or that it can be unlearned, because these are ideas that aren't the idea that we can unlearn it isn't something new. It's just being presented to you in a different way. That there's absolutely nothing wrong with who you are and how you are. There are people out there who love you and think that you're absolutely perfect the way that you are, and you should try to be who you are and be proud of it. You know, back in the day, I was had a lot of issues for being Middle Eastern.
Mm.
I still, and when you're getting like yanked off an airplane or something like that, it's easy to think, well, it'd be easier if I pretended to be something I'm not. I would say to them, don't fall into that trap. It is easier, but at the end of the day, it's really not worth it. And someday people are going to look up to you, so they're going to need some good role models to look up to.
Yeah. Wow. Well, on that note, thank you, Julia. This was really great.
Thank you, and thanks for being among the young people who are not afraid to speak up. I'm really proud of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I can't even begin to tell you how proud I am of what you've done and what you set out to accomplish, and just approaching this with bravery and working with your father, with your nonprofit, and creating a platform for people who've been censored. It's all really impressive.
Well, thank you so much. And I should also just take the moment to remind people that one of the things that I just also launched is a platform for young people to write in anonymously, and I will post the accepted submissions on the site. And so we have one up so far. It's a Q&A with a 18-year-old lesbian who's anonymous.
That's so awesome.
Yeah. So, and especially for young writers too, if they want to write an article or something, they can submit it. So yeah, well, I hope that was galvanized. I think, the last thing you just said was beautiful. So thank you.